Welcome back once again, gang. Welcome to your lecture series for Chapter 12 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled The Age of Reform, 1820 to 1840. The first section of this series is called The Reform Impulse. The focus question for this section is, what were the major movements and goals of antebellum reform? As we have been discussing for the last several chapters, the first half of the 19th century involved numerous social, economic, and political changes. The market revolution, the information revolution, the rise of a new democratic order, and the struggles to come to terms with these rapid and often very profound changes and ideological transformations led many to attempt to promote new social reforms in order to protect the social order as they saw it. However, some reformers tried to withdraw from society completely and create what they termed heavens on earth, or these utopian communities. These various communities and experiments differ greatly in their outlooks, in their ideological perspectives, and in their goals. However, nearly all hope to restore some sense of social harmony through communal property ownership and often unconventional gender norms. These communities introduced the terms socialism and communism into the American social and political thought, even before Karl Marx published his famous Communist Manifesto in the mid-19th century. The most successful of the utopian communities were religiously based and were outgrowths of the Second Great Awakening, that flowering of evangelical Christian thought that spread across the country in the first half of the 19th century. The most successful of the religiously based utopian communities were the Shakers. They were founded by Mother Ann Lee, a female religious leader from Britain, actually, at the time, who immigrated to the United States and founded various Shaker communities from Maine all the way to Kentucky and everywhere in between. They believed in the spiritual equality of men and women. They also held a standard of virgin purity. All of the members of the Shaker communities basically took vows of celibacy, and the men and women lived in separate areas, separate houses. They would come together for worship, but there was no romantic entanglements. They kept that separate and really concentrated on individual salvation as they saw it. You can see in this picture here, this is actually a Shaker celebration where they are doing, their famous dancing, which was the feature of their religious services that gave them their name, the Shakers, because they were known for their frenzied dancing. And you can see the men and the women are separate. They're not together here. They're dancing, together, but separately within the same celebration there. The Shakers were known for their horticulture, their animal husbandry, and for their furniture making, which was how they made a living. Another one of the religious utopias in this period was the Oneida community, which was very much an evangelical Christian community. They believed themselves to have achieved moral perfection and wanted to establish Oneida as a shining beacon on a hill, if you will, to borrow from the old Puritan language for others to look up to and follow. However, they got in some trouble because the founder, John Humphrey Noyes, believed in this system of complex marriage. They did not believe in this idea of one man, one woman, but they believed that everybody in the community was essentially married to each other, and any sort of romantic or sexual relations were community-based, where, people could essentially, sleep with whomever they wanted to, as long as there was mutual permission involved. And of course, this was highly controversial at the time and caused many, many issues for the Oneida community. And the founder, again, John Humphrey Noyes, ran the community like a dictatorship, with him at the top and everyone else having to follow his lead without much of a say into how the communities were run. Another reason why this community in particular received lots of pushback from the press and in the public sphere. There were other utopian communities that took a more secular outlook in how they organized their communities. One example would be Brook Farm, a community founded in Massachusetts in this period by transcendentalists of that transcendentalist intellectual movement that we discussed a few chapters ago. They believed in communal living and work arrangements. However, unlike many of the other utopian communities, they did still believe in the maintenance of private property. The most attracted to this community were intellectuals, again, those transcendentalist thinkers of this period. And in general, these intellectuals disdained physical labor, a big reason why the community didn't last more than a few years. Another one of these sort of secular communities were the Owenites, who were founded by Robert Owen, and they believed in a concept called communitarianism, who were people who plan or live in a completely cooperative community. And this idea of a cooperative community extended even to how they raised their children. The children were separated from the parents and raised at the community level, which was a effort to prioritize the common over the individual good. They were also very staunch defenders of women's rights at this period, and many of the Owenites would become prominent in the later women's rights movement. Just to give you an idea of the extent and the spread of these various utopian communities in the first half of the 19th century, this map here illustrates that to great effect. As you can see, from Maine to Kentucky, all the way over to Iowa and Wisconsin, these communities, both religious and secular, popped up all over the place. But also notice how they're concentrated in the northern part of the United States. This sort of movement did not catch on in the South at all. While some reformers of this period sought to separate themselves from the wider American society and establish their own little mini societies within these utopian communities, other reformers actually attempted to provoke changes in that wider society as a whole. Much of the reform impulse in this period was inspired by the religious changes wrought by the Second Great Awakening, and this religious reform focused on personal individual reform, particularly the idea of eliminating sin from individuals' lives. And there arose a new idea known as perfectionism in this period, which was an idea that individuals and society were indeed capable of constant and indefinite improvement, which really ran counter to previous ideas that society and individuals could only reach a certain level of advancement before they sort of hit a ceiling that, prevented them from advancing any further. This idea of perfectionism threw that out the window and instilled this idea that progress, social, economic, political, was perpetual and could always advance further and further. There was no real end game to the idea of progress or perfection. One of the first reform movements to really gain traction in this period was the Temperance Movement, which was a movement to eliminate alcohol use in American society. The American Temperance Society was founded in 1826, and it was based on this idea that alcohol destroyed families. I mean, particularly men who spent a lot of their time out at the taverns drinking and would waste the family's financial resources, come home and abuse their wives and children, was all seen as endemic and extremely problematic in American society. Of course, because much of the grievance against alcohol was based on this idea of destruction of the family, women were very prominent in this temperance movement. And many of these women who first found their kind of social political voice within this temperance movement would go on to lead the later women's rights movement. Now, of course, attempts to promote temperance aroused considerable hostility from the general public, and many resented these attempts by, so-called, religious ideologues to change public behavior. Many Americans saw these attempts at reform as an attack on freedom itself, particularly around the temperance movement that we just discussed. Public drinking was a feature of many celebrations, including some religious ones like the Catholic Mass. So people were loath to get rid of those sorts of things from society. Reformers, however, saw freedom slightly differently than it had previously been defined. They saw genuine liberty through internal self-discipline. Essentially, freedom meant freeing people from drink, from poverty, from sin. Religious reformers in particular worried about excess liberties, the sort of same sense of fear of democracy and liberty run rampant that ran through the thoughts of many of the early American founders as well. And religious reformers in this period published huge amounts of literature, taking advantage of that information revolution, promoting private and public virtue based on religious principles in efforts to change the mindset and the trajectory of American society at the time. The reform impulse in this period also took the form of new institutional development. New institutions such as jails, asylums for the mentally ill, orphanages began to proliferate in this period. And these new institutions were designed to transform individuals into free, morally upright citizens. And this program of institution building can be seen really as the beginnings of a transformation of this reform impulse from a private ideal into a public responsibility. The new institutions that first gained significant traction in this period was the common school systems. These were tax-supported state school systems open to all regardless of class or economic standing. There was this hope that universal education would breed equality and a socially disciplined population. Now, these common schools opened a tremendous new career opportunity for women in this period, as teaching in public schools was seen as a natural extension of the educational role of Republican motherhood. The common school systems were very successful in many areas in the North. However, they found little support in the southern United States, as there was a general opposition to new taxation to educate the poor population in those regions. Alright, gang, that concludes part 1 of our Chapter 12 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.